All right, in just a moment, we'll be joined by my friend Deroy Murdock. Before we get into that, I want to give a little background here because we're going to jump around the world in this quick conversation as we finish up here today. And thanks again for sharing it with us this day after Christmas. If you happen to notice in the Washington Post, Friday night, the final night before the Christmas weekend into Christmas break, the Washington Post published an article. 7 o'clock was when it came out, so no one would see it, presumably. And this article was about Jamal Khashoggi. If you haven't followed the whole Khashoggi saga, it sort of boils down to this. Khashoggi was a former Saudi citizen living in the U.S. He was writing a column for the Washington Post in part. He goes back to Turkey, supposedly to the Saudi embassy, as part of trying to get married to a new person who I believe he had met in the U.S. and set up a new life for himself. Khashoggi ends up supposedly hacked and sawed to death, essentially, in this embassy, and it's presented as here was a freedom-fighting journalist who wrote articles that were contrary to the views of Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince in Saudi Arabia, and for being a muckraking, freedom-fighting, liberal, capital L liberal, freedom-minded journalist, he found himself killed because he was in MBS's crosshairs. Now, some of us noted when Khashoggi disappeared in the first place and was being presented as this liberal freedom fighter who fearlessly and courageously fought against the regime, that actually he had some questionable ties in his background. Turned out that Khashoggi had been interviewing Osama bin Laden back in the 1980s. He was linked up with the Muslim Brotherhood, very pro-Muslim Brotherhood. In fact, some of his last columns at the Washington Post, one of them was titled, "The U.S. is wrong about the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Arab world is suffering for it." Khashoggi, it turned out, was in favor of political Islam dominating in the Middle East, including in his former home of Saudi Arabia. And it turned out that Khashoggi, far from being a dissident, was very pro-Saudi regime in the past up until MBS came to power. He had worked for state-sponsored media institutions in Saudi Arabia, towing the party line. He had become an insider within the royal family. He had been a mouthpiece for, a propagandist for, in effect, one of the former heads of Saudi intelligence. All of these details, some of us dug into, and we were attacked. There was a headline in the Washington Post, October 19th, "Conservatives mount a whisper campaign smearing Khashoggi in defense of Trump." Ultimately, what Khashoggi was used for was to attack U.S. policy, which U.S. policy under the Trump administration has been a realignment against Iran, as we just spoke with Tony Badgeron about before, including allying with relatively secular authoritarians in the Middle East as a counterbalance against the Iranians. And MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, was a key player in that, and Khashoggi's alleged murder was used as a wedge. It was used as a human shield, in a sense, that could be leveraged to try to disrupt this Saudi, U.S., other Sunni Arab partner, Israel alliance partnership taking place as a bulwark against the Iranians. He was used as a wedge, and it also bears noting that he was used as a wedge not only politically against the president to say, how could you support an authoritarian like MBS who goes about killing this freedom-fighting, liberty-loving journalist like this, but also used to elevate the Turks. This happened in Turkey at a Saudi embassy, this alleged murder, and the Turks themselves are competing with the Saudis for primacy in the Sunni Arab world, and of course seeking to elevate themselves above the Saudis. And we've seen in several moves since then that the Saudi relationship may or may not be being slightly downgraded while the Turks are elevating, including their role in, among other places, in Syria, where we are essentially pulling out and they are filling our vacuum in this dance to try to weed out, finally, ISIS. I want to talk with my friend Deroy Murdock, who's a Fox News contributor and a contributing editor of National Review Online, about Khashoggi and also about his predictions in 2020. Deroy, sorry for that long lead-in, but thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Hi, Ben. How are you? Good to talk to you. Happy Boxing Day.
I appreciate that. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and all sorts of other felicitations as well. I did want to ask, what do you make of the fact that the end of this whole Khashoggi story is that the Washington Post, right before Christmas, dropped essentially all the details that conservatives had been picking apart for some time about his actual background. Suddenly, they seem to be mounting a smear whispering campaign because they're reporting exactly what many of us were talking about 2 months ago before this entire information operation unfolded.
Well, the fact that they put it out when they did says to you that they want to have it sort of available but not particularly showcased or highlighted. I think that's probably fairly clear. I think the Khashoggi case, obviously we don't want to see journalists killed and certainly not dismembered. And I'm most struck by the fact that if the Saudis wanted to eliminate this man, how completely ham-fisted they were about this. You'd think a major power like Saudi Arabia could eliminate somebody without having, basically bloody footprints walking right up to the front of the Saudi embassy in Turkey. I thought that was astonishing. But as you point out, we have learned about Khashoggi that he was pro-Muslim Brotherhood, that he was probably a Salafist in orientation and not sort of a Western-oriented freedom fighter, as I think he was sort of presented by the media after his apparent murder and butchering.
Yeah, and of course, this has been used as a political issue, which is a very sad commentary, to put it lightly, on the idea that this dismembering, as you described, has been used to in an attempt to effectively upend the Trump administration's posture towards the Middle East. And of course, it's more than unsavory for someone to be supposedly chopped up to death. But the broader context of this has been missed, and that's one of the reasons why, some of us have really been raising this issue. I do want to go back to domestic policy a little bit, and throughout today, we've been talking about the shutdown, immigration, the wall. First, I just want to get your take. What do you make of this so-called, partial shutdown and how it's transpired to date?
Well, it is partial. This is not the entire government being shut down. I think 75% of the government, in fact, is funded. And this is an effort, yet again, by the Democrats to keep the borders wide open. People use the term open borders. I think the term is no borders. They seem to want to erase the border completely and just throw the place open and let anybody march in. That's a very different posture than they had when they voted on the Secure Fence Act back in 2006. Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, Obama all voted yes on, I think it was 700 miles of double fences along the border at the cost of, I believe, $30 billion, if I'm not wrong. I may be wrong on that number, but it's definitely more than $5 billion. And now, of course, they're opposed to that, and I think the one difference is that Donald J. Trump came along, and if he's for it, then obviously they're against it, which is quite the horror show. What I wish the president would do, he hasn't done this yet, is do an address to the nation from the Oval Office. He ought to do it tonight and tell the networks he wants time to address the entire nation from the Oval Office, explain how important this is. And he's very good about talking about the idea of people running across the border without permission. We get illegal drugs, including heroin, coming across, MS-13. All that's important and vital. But one aspect of this he doesn't discuss. I don't know why he and people who agree, like you and I do, that this border needs to be secure. People don't talk about the folks coming across the border who are not from Central America, such as in 2016, 84 Afghans, 111 people from Iran, 522 from Pakistan, 35 from Yemen. These are the people who were arrested. Now, they may be coming here for better lives, let's hope so, but you don't know if any of these people are coming from those places with the intention of becoming deep cover agents, waiting instructions from Tehran or from Karachi or elsewhere. Who knows what these people are up to? They're not presenting their papers. We don't know who they are. They're not being vetted, and that is a potential terrorism disaster in the making. And I don't know why this aspect of this story doesn't come up. I wish the President of the United States would go on the air from the Oval Office and explain this aspect of this disaster and others, and tell the American people to contact their senators and get this funding approved before the 116th Congress comes in, at which point it's going to be very difficult to get $1 or $2 for the wall, much less $5.7 billion.
So in your view, then, do Democrats prioritize the philosophical virtue of open borders over national security in and of itself, or is it that they haven't even really been presented with the argument, so they have nothing that they have to fight and argue for?
I think they see people coming across the border, as I call them, the future Democrats of America, Somebody called them undocumented Democrats. You can use either term. And I think they basically see it as an opportunity to bring in people who are more than likely are going to vote Democrat, if not in 10 or 20 years, maybe it's 30 years, maybe their kids do. The Democrats play the long game. They're thinking in 10, 20, 30, 40 years down the road. Republicans think about maybe the next election if you're lucky. So I think that's a big part of it. I think that's what's driving this. And part of it also is to embarrass President Trump and make sure that he doesn't have a victory on his number one signature issue. I think those are probably the two strongest things going on here. So again, I think the way to box them in is to stress the national security angle. And if you talk about the fact that you've got 44 people from Syria, 164 from Somalia in 2016 being arrested at the border, it's very hard to couch that as you hate Mexicans. How come you hate Guatemalans? What do you have against Hondurans? It's all anti-Hispanic racism. That charge does not stick at all when you present the American people with those facts, and that this is a serious national security problem, in addition to being a diplomatic problem, a humanitarian problem, a crime problem, and all these other things. I don't think the national security aspect of this has been presented anywhere as clearly or sharply or relentlessly as it should be.
Well, and then the other question is, why should Republicans have to make the argument about national security when our leadership obviously is aware of all the costs to porous borders and illegal immigration, both the near-term costs, the national security costs, and ultimately the political suicide that the situation presents? And I talked with Rachel Bovard before and asked her opinion on it, but I'd be curious to get yours as well. What is the point of a lame duck if you're not going to use it? 60 votes are not needed in the Senate in order to get this $5 billion of funding, which is measly in context of the whole broader federal budget. Why can't leadership be dragged along, and why does leadership have to be dragged along in the first place to get this done?
I think, unfortunately, so many of the Republicans are just weak. I think the GOP leadership is defined by two things. One is weakness, and the other is fright. They should be voting right now. They're still on vacation. I'm glad that the House passed the funds last Thursday or Friday, I believe. That's a good thing, but they were gone from the week before that. The Senate's not there now. These people should be there voting and voting and voting on one amendment after another after another. Another amendment they ought to approve is an idea from Mo Brooks of Alabama and Ted Cruz of Texas, which is any money recovered from El Chapo or any of these other drug traffickers in Mexico, that money would be used to pay for the wall. I'd love to see the Democrats explain why that's a bad idea and make them vote on it. And then if they vote against it, use that issue against them at the next election. I mean, these people should be voting. They should have a vote every half hour on one aspect of this after another. And I think the Republican policy tends to be, well, if we're nice to Democrats, they'll be nice to us. And you and I know that's not true. So they might as well, while they're still in power, have these people voting and voting and voting until they are too embarrassed at voting no, so they ultimately vote yes on these things. The GOP needs to stop being so nice and instead be tough and as relentless, disciplined and focused as the Democrats are. I do not appreciate their ideas, which are terrible, but you must admire the focus and the relentlessness of the Democrats, which you see on display on one issue after the next.
Well, I'd say amen to that, and I've said it a couple of times already today, but I'd echo it again. You always have to ask yourself the question, what would Barack Obama, Chuck Schumer, and Nancy Pelosi do if they were in the equivalent situation? And in almost zero sets of circumstances do you see Republicans acting in a commensurate fashion. And we've only got a couple minutes left, but I would ask you, given the dim hopes for proffering and actually executing upon conservative agenda items with a divided Congress over the next 2 years, what would you urge Republican House and Senate members to be doing with their time over the next 2 years?
Well, remember, we still have the Senate. So the Senate, first and foremost, should be approving as many people, as many of President Trump's appointees as they can, both to the federal bench and also to the various federal departments and agencies and ambassadors. I mean, they ought to be just approving as many of these people as they can. So at least the bench and the bureaucracy will have people who share the Make America Great agenda. I think they ought to investigate in the Senate. They ought to continue to investigate the crimes of the Clintons. To my knowledge, there's not been one public hearing on Uranium One. I do not know why, with Republicans running the House and Republicans running the Senate, there's not been one hearing on Uranium One. I think all that needs to be continued to be exposed. And the Senate ought to vote on as many positive things as they can, send them to the House. I think very, very little of that will be approved, but at least we'll be able to get maybe a few things through, and if not, put the Democrats on record for voting no on very positive things that would make this country better. And if they vote them down, then in 2 years we'll take them out.